everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today I'm going to be going through the 5 issues of Tom Kaczynski's cartoon Dialectics that I have. Tom was kind enough to send these over almost a year ago now. I thought we were going to talk about these more when Sean and I talked to him, and so I kind of left them on the shelf, and then we mostly talked about his beta testing the Apocalypse, and then kind of like loosely said, oh, we should talk like once a month or something, and then just life has gotten in the way. So these have been sitting around wanting to talk about them. Hopefully we can get back with Tom, because I would really love to just have a conversation about the ideas in here as a conversation on its own. But issue 4 of I don't know what volume, because the way it's listed in these, apparently there have been earlier volumes that are out of print now, and I think this is number 3 from one of the earlier volumes of Cartoon Dialectics. But I have issues. Yeah, see, this has Cartoon Dialectics Volume 1 out of print, Cartoon Dialectics Volume 2 and Volume 3. Volume 2 exists in scarce quantities. Volume 3 is plentiful, but then these, which are like the newest ones, are presenting themselves as Volume 2, because this is the Baudrillard and the Orgy of Modern... Maybe not. No. I don't know. I don't know how the volumes are going on this. So I don't know if I've read all of the Cartoon Dialectics or not. If there's stuff that's out of print or that never got printed, because there's a lot of things that are listed that are like, I'm working on this, but it hasn't been printed yet. So I don't quite know, but these are amazing comics. They're so interesting. Tom is obviously really well read, really philosophical. I consider him a rogue scholar. He's not like publishing these in an academic context, but he is doing academic work about comics in a comics form, and then also wrapping that into some larger narrative. So they're very complex books, and they're so dense with ideas. I could probably talk all day about them, but I'm going to try and make as succinct of a review of them and the ideas that Tom is presenting in here as I can. And then hopefully at some point, I'll be able to link up with Tom and really hash through the ideas and be able to have a real conversation about them. I'm really glad that if this is from an earlier run of it, that I have this particular issue, because it has this essay in the front and back that is basically outlining Tom's argument for comics as the best technology of thought for today. He starts out with a Marshall McLuhan approach, talking about, and Marshall McLuhan is someone who's absolutely essential. I think Tom and I, one of the reasons I probably respond really strongly to Tom's work is we've read a lot of the same stuff. I think we have a lot of the same ideas as well, but like there's a couple core touch points for us, like Heidegger and Marshall McLuhan, but then I think he went like this way with it, and I like went this way with it. So the other kind of references that we have, like he's going to be reading Baudrillard and I'm going to be reading Luciano Floridi, which are very different approaches to like philosophy of technology and philosophy of information and stuff. I kind of understand some of the ideas about Baudrillard, but I've never read it. And Tom's talking about a lot of things that I understand, but I don't think he's read Floridi's work. So we're viewing the same topics from different angles, but he's starting with McLuhan, which is kind of one of my starting points as well. And McLuhan really opened my mind up, and he's talking about Marshall McLuhan associating the invention of type, especially like the Gutenberg press, as turning us from a fairly non-linear mythological creature into a linear scientific creature, and that we're now, after a very short period of that historically, going back to a more non-linear mythological primitive mind. That's kind of the setup here. And he's talking about digital primitivism, and also is communicating a bit something he's not using the term, but I would call hyperhistory. He's saying paradoxically, the most advanced media today replicate and privilege older modes of communication. That this is making a new world. The most advantaged technology breeds primitivism, and that's because we're headed back to an audio visual way of being and seeing the world. And I mean, even Plato, who Tom obviously is very influenced by and talks about a lot, even wrote like a serious man's not going to put his actual beliefs in writing, because he was very suspicious of writing as linear. That's why Plato wrote dialogues. He's trying to mimic the amorphous kind of thing of an actual dialogue. That's how thought and philosophy should really happen. That as soon as you lock it down, it dies. And that's, I think, part of this. But also the idea of hyperhistory is that, we've entered this state where there's no grand narrative anymore. Tom talks about that in these books as something that we've lamented, the loss of the grand narrative. And especially with social media, it's put us in a place where now I've called it the right to write has been expanded to everyone. Everyone has the right to write their story, and it's in a public venue. It's accessible to everyone. Another phrase that I came up in an essay I wrote is that things no longer go to press, they're always pressing. And that's part of what Tom's talking about with the digital primitive mind, is that we exist back in what I call a loosely linear world. There's logical linear jumps from any one thought to the next, but the web that you get out of that is completely non-linear. But we're never just usually making insane non sequitur jumps. There's usually some linear connection from one thought to another. But we're entering the audio linguistic primitive non-linear world, and then that's bringing with it hyperhistory, and things don't go to press; they're always pressing. And he talks about that as being we'll get to it. It's such a complex, interesting set of ideas. But anyways, Tom comes up then with a series of things that he thinks need to be ways of thinking to navigate this world that he's talking about. That things need to be slow, they need to have spatial and temporal integrity, they need to be multisensory, they need to have the possibility of abstraction, and materiality has to have a unique presence, and it must resist digitalization. And then he says comics do all of those things, and then he makes an argument for how comics fulfill each of those criteria. I think some of those arguments now, I don't know, I didn't see a date on this book. I think some of those might be falling apart, which is like why I would love to talk to Tom and really dig in deep with this. I think with our backgrounds and reading backgrounds and stuff, we could go really deep on these topics. But fascinating stuff. And then he's got these narrative pieces throughout the book that are like showing the consequences of these things on the world. We've had like a global warming event. These things are published non-linear too. They seem to be bits and pieces of larger projects that are just coming out here and there. And it will say coming next issue, and then you won't see it till 3 issues later or whatever. Tom's changing his mind as he goes. I don't know. But there seems to be like a global warming event. There's like post-apocalyptic world that fits very well. A lot of what Tom's talking about are dystopias and utopias and these kind of things. So he's kind of showing that whole process in a narrative form to accentuate what he's talking about in the essay portions. And I think that's really cool as well, because he's realizing that man is both scientific and mythological, and to make people feel something, you tell them in a scientific prose approach to make it explicit, but then to make people feel it and consume it and respond to it, you have to tell them a story. And I think that's what his strategy is in this book. And I think that's part of why he's saying comics is a really great, because you can mix the more linear nature of prose with the more non-linear, like being able to consume the gestalt of the whole page all at once. You can operate in both modes, and so you can hit both parts of the human brain. You can get the scientific brain and the mythological brain. And then there's just a lot of information in here. Like, this is his timeline of comics. So there's some aspects of Tom as this rogue academic, rogue scholar, being a historian as well. He's showing how we suck here, which I think is great. It became clear that humans were the problem. Their insatiable thirst for technological comforts. They were willing to destroy the whole planet to avoid feeling a little cold. By running the heater, we're actually going to make it colder overall. And that's a core theme throughout as well, that, humans as we are pretty destructive to our environment. And, I just really enjoy his cartooning in these moments. And I think he's spot on with this assessment of us as creatures that are prone to expediency, and that expediency, anytime you're taking a shortcut, you usually just cause a bigger problem for yourself over time. And even within these stories, that's going to drive people nuts. I bent that page. I don't care. It's a comic. I meant to read it. Even within this, he's putting some of his thoughts from the essays into the story as well. So this character's running away and says, Project Cthulhu was enormous, multi-dimensional monitoring, sophisticated space-time line probabilistic directions, real-time biosphere hyper-object modeling, capacity pattern analysis, post-singularity extrapolators, and then there's a dot that says nothing. And I think that's exactly right. Like, I've always thought that we're in a weird place with science fiction where I don't really feel like, since people began talking about the singularity in science fiction and nanotechnology and AI and all of this stuff, what's the guy, Snow Crash, I'm forgetting his name right now, I don't think anyone's really envisioned what the world will look like beyond that yet. And I really do think that we've basically, science fiction, imagined ourselves up to the point of post-humanity, and I think it may be literally impossible for us to imagine the world post us. Like, we can't. There's a point, and I think Tom's right in that the idea of the singularity is the point where technology outpaces us and we can't keep up with it, which I honestly think we're there already. You can't really extrapolate out from the real, like, where the exponential curve really takes off, and the idea of the singularity, you can't extrapolate past that, I don't think. And so I really like that. I think that's really funny. Here you have the slogan on the back, comics are a technology of consciousness. 100% agree. Love it. In my interactions with Tom and a lot of the artists that he has with him over at Uncivilized Books, I think that Tom, it's hard to tell politically, but I think he's a bit of an anarchist. He's pretty critical of both socialism and consumerism in these books. But I know it kills him that he has to sell these things, because when you're critiquing consumerism but you're selling a product, that can get a bit strange. And so he's always writing the price on here. It says, accursed shame, $5. And I think that's really funny. These books are super well produced. Like, Tom knows, really, his production chops are top notch. Everything from Uncivilized Books look great. And then from what Sean's told me, there's actually a printing press close enough that Tom's able to, I don't know if these were printed there or not, but Tom's able to actually go there and work with them. And you can tell that awareness of printing, at least, is within the work itself. You saw that in Craig Thompson's Ginseng Roots as well, that the knowing the constraints of the production processes that they have available to them actually led to innovation in the artwork. Here's a real fun, just like formalism in the sequence, where Tom is just using the lettering to say, we can do it. And that's like, yeah, come on, we can do it. And then here it's like, we can do it. And it's like, yeah, come on, sexual liberation. And so he's building it up like, women can vote, women can work. And then here, then it's, you want to, and then you're going to mentally fill in, do it. But first, let's have a Coke. So he's setting you up for like if you're going to rhyme a bad word and you're setting some up to think you're going to rhyme a bad word and then you don't, and you force them to contribute, he forces the reader into that. Really fun little trick with the writing here. Here he starts talking about Baudrillard and the idea of modernity as an orgy. And now we're after the orgy of modernity and the liberalism that comes with that, and saying that now all we can do is simulate the orgy, simulate the liberation. And I think we can extend that. I forget who said it. I'm pretty sure it was our buddy NFN Callion who pointed out to me that this idea that like a simulation theory of the universe, we're existing in a simulation and we're existing in like someone else's program. Not that we do live in a simulation, but it doesn't have to be viewed as like this external computer that we're living in. It's that we have removed ourselves so far from the world by making things expedient that pretty much everything we do is a simulation of liberty. It's a simulation of real sex. It's a simulation of nature, that we're pretty much at this point have because of expediency wound up simulating everything. And Tom's definitely poking at that in these books as well. Here is a piece where Tom is talking about how jobs constrain. This one seems autobiographical, where it's like he had a job and then he jumped out of his job and became a freelancer, and in that sense took some constraints off. This piece I have a little bit of an argument against, because and I think Tom acknowledges it to some extent on this page, and maybe that's what the story is about in the end. But this idea of like, I'm trying to get out of the constraints. And then what you wind up with is the realization that like existence itself is a constraint. Having a body itself is a constraint. So if you're so worried about how the system constrains you, you're just not paying attention to all these other constraints that are on you. And if you're claustrophobic and don't like being constrained, I don't know, like you're stuck, man. You're stuck in reality. And so Tom is suggesting here that the way to deal with that is, as much as possible, you can't get outside of constraints, but what you can do is you can try to some extent to choose your own constraints. So ritual, routine, and discipline. The body is a temple. And he's taking this from the 36 Chambers of Shaolin movie that he was watching. So that idea of generating self-constraints, like going and working with a printer and knowing the parameters and working within those constraints, makes you creative. So I think Tom actually is making the point that, you got to get over it and take control of it. I've always really liked the lyric from MC Paul Barman that says, if you think outside of the box, you're stuck in one. And that feels very relevant. And I just wrote something the other day where I said, a world without boxes scares me the most because it's a world without exits. And I'm an agoraphobic, I think, more than a claustrophobic, although they feel the same sometimes. If I feel like I can't get out of something, it can feel very claustrophobic to me. So a world with no exits is scarier to me than a world where, once I don't like being in a box, I can get out of it. And I think Tom's talking about that a little bit as well. In this section here, Tom goes for the first time really hard into Heidegger, and that was, I was already really enjoying the series, but I think this is the moment where I was like, yeah, this guy's he's thinking a lot of the same things I've been thinking about, and he's doing a very clear cartooning example of Heidegger's idea of ready to hand and ready at hand. I always forget which is which, but when something's ready to hand, I think it's when you're using it. And he sums that up very succinctly here. We tend to use tools without noticing them and focus instead on the house or ship that we are building. The hammer remains invisible to us. So that's, I think, the ready to hand. Like you're just using it and you're operating with it. And this is what cartoonists are really great at, is they draw the mental image of the use value of the thing. And Tom's doing that here. He's drawing a cartoon hammer. And then he says, we notice the tool only when it breaks. And then Tom does a more realistic version of it. And that's what Heidegger's talking to with the ready at hand, I think, if I got my terminology right from Being in Time, is that when the thing breaks, then you look at it in detail. And you're no longer operating with the icon of it in your mind, but you're seeing it for what it is. And that has impacted my that idea has impacted my approach to teaching drawing dramatically, because I realize that what I'm trying to do, and I lament this oftentimes, is when we're trying to teach someone to draw, especially draw representationally, which is usually the goal in like a drawing one class, we're teaching them to look at objects as if they're broken. And that the reason so many people are bad at drawing, they cartoon and they draw icons, is because we actually do most of the time spent our time in the world engaged in using the world and not analyzing a broken world. And the mindset you need to be in to draw realistically is to look at the world as if everything's broken and you're trying to find the problem. It's a very attentive analytical mind state. So Tom talks about that and then represents this complex idea really well in 4 panels, which is really crazy. Then he goes on to talk about utopias quite a bit. The utopian horizon is always in motion. It can never represent the present moment. I think that's a really, really deep thought as well, that there is no utopia. As soon as you get to a new utopia, there's something like you can always get better. There's never a perfection. And then you become interested in the idea of dystopias, because dystopias are the way that we kind of predict dystopian science fiction is like how, as we move towards our current idea of utopia, we're trying to avoid the problems. And that becomes a major theme throughout the rest of these works, as well as Tom kind of explores those ideas through different lenses. In this section, Tom talks about that idea of the internet and what I call hyperhistory, the impact of that on the human psyche. We built a nervous system, not a communication system. Communication is slow and it requires time and effort. The internet is fast and requires no effort. And then that means that we have not only taken our consciousness, but we've put our nervous system out into the world. And like I said, nothing goes to press anymore. It's always pressing. So you respond too fast. You're always like that, that's why the shit always blows up on Twitter, is it's always the poke the raw nerve and respond response, rather than stop, think about it, edit it, have someone else look it over, put it through like the scientific process of linear modernity that Tom is talking about, that is communication. It's slowed down and you're trying to make your point. You're not just responding. And he's saying that the internet especially has turned us into very raw creatures. Nerves react before thinking. Sometimes the brain can even react. The internet, the twitchy nerve of the world, the planet's becoming schizophrenic and warm. And there he's using Marshall McLuhan terminology, warm and cool. It's overheating because nerves make you feel hot. Hot in the brain, hot. Better to go outside, put some comics in your bag, walk, ride a bike to a nice spot somewhere, have a picnic, do some calisthenics, worship the sun, and lose yourself in the unique experience of reading a comic book. And he suggests doing that slowly. And also says, don't be afraid to have some new ideas. It's just an idea. You can forget it. Like, don't be afraid of encountering an idea you don't like. Like, you don't have to keep it. You can forget it and think about something else. What if you can't stop thinking about it? Maybe there's something interesting there. Think about that. So, I mean, I've been going on forever, I feel like, and that's just one issue. I apologize, but these are so dense. Then here again, production, these really intense fluorescent colors. The kind of spot colors are different in every issue. Love the production, the cover on that. A little hard to look at. Some more writing here. He comes up with, I think Tom came up with this maybe, but it's a really great neologism. He says phenomenal, but then he inserts a U in there in brackets, so it's phenomenal. And that's a really interesting neologism to me, because in the same way that Baruch Spinoza collapses the mind-body duality into just two sides of the same thing, Tom is using that neologism to collapse like the Kantian idea of the nominal world, which is the world that we don't have access to. I most recently have started calling it the Ruliad, based on Stephen Wolfram's idea of the Rulliad, which is basically just all possible, infinite possible, all possible computations being run. That's kind of the nominal world, like the data behind existence is how I think about it. And then the phenomenal world, the phenomenology, which is coming from Husserl into Heidegger and into Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Alvin Noe and a lot of people like that. That's the embedded within it experience. And so Tom, I think, is suggesting that in the same way there's no actual divide behind mind and body, they're just two different lenses for the same thing, that the nominal and the phenomenal are two sides of the same thing. And we've been having a misled debate. And that's really what dialectics is you're taking these two things that are supposed to be polar opposites and you synthesize them. So I'm pretty sure that's exactly what Tom is doing there. I don't know if he came up with that or got it somewhere else, but it's a really nice neologism that I really like. And then taking that into kind of the world of my world of philosophy of information, the quantum physicist who's working on quantum computers, Seth Lloyd, did the same thing with information and energy. He's collapsed those into the same thing. We used to think about those as kind of different things, and he talks about it from qubit, and that really the way that we talk about entropy in information and entropy in the physical world are exactly mathematically equivalent, and so you can collapse them. It's just a lens thing. So, I mean, all of that coming out of, Tom's condensed all of that. I guess that would make it pretty hard to read if you're not familiar with these concepts, or you might miss some of that. But I think he's doing a really good job of explaining these things and then giving these awesome illustrations to go with it. This page is a book recommendations he has. This issue is focusing on the apocalypse. Eschatology is writing about the end time, the apocalypse. So these are books that Tom is recommending. Eschatological book club that's on theme for like the utopia dystopia that he's talking about. And this one is the apocalypse, utopia dystopia. And he references this book Instability by Stanislaw Ignacy Witkiewicz. It's really interesting because Tom says before red pills, blue pills, black pills, clear pills, there was the Murdy-Bing pill. The Murdy-Bing pill creates a feeling of widespread content and obedience. This is a book that was written in 1932, and I thought it's really strange that Tom didn't mention Soma from Brave New World. I don't remember if it was a pill they take, but it's kind of that drug that makes everyone content and obedient in Brave New World. So I had to look up the dates on when Brave New World was written and released, and Brave New World was written in 1931 and released in 32. This was released or written in 1932 in Poland. I have no idea. It's probably one of those things where just two people are talking about the same thing without any connection to each other. But I just thought it was funny that Tom didn't shout out Huxley as there, because I'm pretty sure he does somewhere else. Tom has a really keen sense of actual historical scope. A lot of problems in thought today, as far as I can tell, is because people just can't think big enough. A lot of people's minds don't seem capable of navigating the idea of infinity or navigating the idea of billions of years, hundreds of millions of years of evolution. But Tom is really, really good at navigating that. He's really aware of the true scale and scope of history. We don't need cosmic or planetary events. Life itself is very good at extinguishing life, and he's giving the historical, like how we got such an oxygenated planet. That the first ever extinction event that we know of was caused by runaway atmospheric emissions from newly evolved species. They were basically farting out, breathing out oxygen. 2.4 billion years ago, cyanobacteria evolved photosynthesis. The oxygen emitted by these new photosynthetic organisms accumulated in the atmosphere, basically set up for the world that we're living in today. When you take that view, this idea of like the need for humanity to survive, or the idea that humans are somehow the apex of the Darwinian game of evolution just becomes absolutely ridiculous. We're new on the block. Other things have been around and survived a lot more, and we're so stupid. We're going to basically terraform, which is book 4. We're going to terraform our environment in a way where it's not something we can live in. It's not habitable for us, but it will create some type of new life. Like I've always been driven nuts by the environmentalists that are like, you're destroying the planet, you're going to kill planet Earth. No, like that's hubristic. We aren't that great. We're going to ruin it for ourselves. That's what they mean. It's very selfish. They put it out there as like loving nature, but really is they want nature for them to continue existing in. And when you look at this large scale, it becomes kind of laughable. Like, yeah, that's because you're here and you have this weird urge to stay alive and procreate and spread the species. Tom is talking about the means we have become geological agents. Our activity will be recorded in the geological strata. Look, son, the 20th century. We humans are now a force of nature, an elemental force. I think that is really well stated, and he's showing very succinctly an interesting idea of, hey, we lit fire. We did manipulation of the environment to create agriculture. We built things out of the earth. We learned to navigate the water. But you can see technology coming in this. And I think part of what Tom is asking here is there a distinction between the natural and the artificial? A lot of critiques against humanity as we've gone, even in the last issue, this simulation, this artificial simulation of nature. But we are a force of nature. Our activities are natural activities. Is a bee's hive artificial? Is it an artifact? Or is it just a natural thing? It's the natural behavior of an animal. Just because we have much more complicated and a wider variety of artifacts that we create, I don't think means it's not part of some larger natural process. And he's acknowledging that here. We are a force of nature. The artifacts we create are a force of nature at work. That's the type of nature that we are. Really, I mean, I just think Tom's right on pretty much everything he's saying throughout these. And in the back here, he refers to language difficulties are understandable. He's talking about himself as an immigrant here, and English being his third language, which he's obviously has a perfect command over. But saying language difficulties are understandable. However, this cultural dyslexia extends to other domains. And what he's talking about here is the coldness of articulating difficult concepts is like trying to jam a square block into a round hole, especially when you're saying it slowly grows dominant, imperceptibly replacing the mother tongue, but the new words don't fit somehow. They're always awkward and misshapen. That is something that was made very clear to me when I was in grad school. We had an event where we brought in basically like a symposium, brought in a bunch of scholars to talk about the topic of identity. And the guy that I really wound up getting along with and hanging out with was from Mexico, born and raised in Mexico. Spanish was his first language. And he had come to the States to go to school. And he was explaining to me, and I mean, this guy had flawless English. I mean, a little bit of an accent maybe, but flawless English. A really smart guy, same like Tom, could write academic articles all day, no problem. Like, he was fully fluent in English, probably more so than the majority of actual English speakers in America. But he told me, he said, I can't fall in love in English. Like, because I learned English in an academic context, I only know how to talk in English in that right here, what Tom is saying, like this, the words don't fit. They're somehow misshapen. It was too cold and academic for him. He didn't know how to be poetic, I guess, in English. So I thought that was really interesting. And that's why I just love these books, because there's so many points where Tom is talking about something that I've obsessed over for many years, and he's putting that in a succinct way that's coming from a different experience, but kind of reaching the same conclusions. And that's really gratifying as a thinker. It's really, really fun. Issue 3 of Cartoon Dialectics is an interesting little flip book. The first side of it here is basically just a chapter out of beta testing the apocalypse where someone is developing these skyways around a city and they're trying to get a meta view of the city. Like we won't actually understand the city unless we can like live above it, which is an interesting idea. But I'm gonna skip over the rest of that because it's in that other book which we've talked about. On the flip side are two pieces. They're basically the same piece. The first one is an expanded version of something Tom had already done himself, but then with some additions about Donald Trump added to it. This issue is focused basically on nostalgia as a type of utopian longing and nostalgia as it relates to Trump. And then after that, I'll show you there's the same piece over again. It must have been the earlier piece, but this is illustrated by Clara Jetsmark, this one about Trump here. So they're talking about Trump as kind of nostalgia and the two types of nostalgia and Trump hitting both of them. And then Tom's trying to think like what era is it that when Trump's saying let's make America great again and is pushing that nostalgia button, what is he referring to? Is it the 30s with the Great Depression? Was it the Roaring 20s? No, none of us even remember that. Was it the 40s? That wasn't a great time. Was it the 50s? And then he says, it was probably the 80s and Ronald Reagan, and he even stole his slogan from something that Reagan said, let's make America great again. I think that's pretty obvious that Trump is, I mean, to me, I've always thought about Trump as the icon of like, if you distilled the 80s, at least the yuppie side of the 80s, the coke snorting, Wall Street broker, American Psycho 80s, like, I don't think you can get any more 80s than Trump. I mean, he just is the instantiation of that. So that seems pretty obvious. But the cartooning here by Clara Jetsmark's really awesome. I really love her cartooning style. Tom says, nostalgia mythologizes experience. That is a really, really cool thing. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the difference between myth and science. Nostalgia, because it relies on memory, is by nature fragmented. The memories of the good times are a synthetic reconstruction, a myth that obscures reality. And because human beings, I truly believe, are narrative-driven creatures, myth is stronger for us than facts. We are not good scientists, most of us, and even people who are the best scientists in the world, their emotions and their memories and their mythological narrative thinking most definitely overrides them. And that's why we always have all these great men that have awful things going on in their life, because we are mythological creatures. And Tom's explaining why nostalgia works so well, because it appeals to the mythological part of our brain and obscures scientific reality. This piece here is talking about when nostalgia went from being a mental illness to being a normalized condition. Nostalgia was first coined in the 17th century to diagnose the intense homesickness of Swiss mercenary soldiers who spent years away from their homes. Over time, the diagnosis broadened to include people and workers of the newly industrialized economies of the 18th and 19th century. That's a process that we're still undergoing, where a lot of things that were once thought to be mental illnesses are now becoming normalized. The strangest one to me most recently is this attempt to normalize dissociative identity disorder. This idea of like these people aren't crazy, they're plural beings. I'm sure I'll be the bigot, and 200 years from now we'll look back on having multiple personalities as nothing more than nostalgia. But I also wonder like how many, I don't even want to call them mental illnesses, but how many unhelpful malfunctions of mental processes can we normalize before we've made ourselves entirely unhealthy species? But you always have to balance that against like the consideration of like, yeah, they miss their family. Like, no shit, man. So he's opening up the dialogue here in the book, I think, to say, how do we handle this stuff? At what point should we be normalizing something? At At what point do we help people? How do we interpret these things to understand that this is coming from our mythological nature? I just don't think we've properly solved those questions, and I don't think people are actually answering them really in the right way at all currently. This is another really interesting idea. The speed of technological change makes even recent past unimaginably distant, foreign, and strange. And he shows the phone booth, which, like, within mine and Tom's lifetime, this is a completely outdated piece of technology. But still, on the scale of like how quick things are becoming old and nostalgic now. I first read this like a year ago. When I read this, we were still dealing with abolition of man. We had been doing it for about a year, and I was already, or maybe even just 6 months, I don't know. But it was within months that I was nostalgic for the Mid-Journey that I first interacted with, and lamented how much better it had gotten. I still don't like the more polished images that people get out of the AI now. And that kind of erasure and push into nostalgia, for that to happen within months is pretty scary. That's why I think we probably are already in the singularity, as technology and the process of nostalgia is now happening on a scale of months. And that's pretty scary. I mean, this is like at least a couple decades for that to go out into nostalgia. Then, as that piece about Trump ends, he's talking about using the nostalgia to talk about why Trump was able to be president, and then kind of wondering also how Trump will be remembered. And we're now facing potentially a second Trump presidency, where maybe find the answer to Tom's question here. But who knows over time. Then there's a repetition of basically all of the ideas about nostalgia. Nostalgia is reflective nostalgia, or there's a nostalgia. There's two types of nostalgia: political nostalgia, reflective nostalgia. He's saying Trump kind of leverages both of those. But this must be an earlier piece that Tom wrote and illustrated himself, just talking about nostalgia, that then got reworked to contextualize Trump and then drawn by someone else. So it's cool to have those two things in there right next to each other to see how Tom developed this concept in the comic and then applied it to a real world situation later. In this piece, Tom does talk explicitly about the singularity, talking about Alvin Toffler, 1970. This guy made a eerily prescient diagnosis. He predicted that the rapid and constant technological change would disrupt societies and cause future shock. It's a bit more than that. It's like if you don't know the singularity, it's misrepresented oftentimes as representing the moment where AI becomes actually full AI instead of just the weak AI. It becomes AI, general intelligence, AGI, rather than what we have now, which is weak AI. But the actual first thought of the singularity was just that there will be a point at which technological process, which is like the technological progress we've made in 100 years, the next time we'll make that same amount of progress. In 50 years, the next time we'll make that amount of progress. In 25 years is that same thing with the nostalgia, where now we're seeing these things like the technological processes, with the AI stuff. I watched it within a year. We went from these weird distorted images that couldn't do hands to like photorealism to AI video that's already starting to look pretty good. We're taking off, it's years and months now. And the singularity is the idea of the point where that doubling rate is just so fast that we can't keep up with it. If you ask me, we're already there. We don't know what we're doing anymore as we go through with it. But people generally now say, well, AI is going to be the mechanism. It used to be like, we don't know the mechanism. I think honestly that the internet was the mechanism that tipped us over. Maybe even electricity. Electricity might have been the thing that put us in a race towards technological development we can't keep up with. And then in this panel, Tom says, we're told feelings are more important than thinking, as though they were contradictions. I feel like you don't understand. I think you are wrong. The pre-scientific attitudes are accompanied by a wave of nostalgia. So again, he's comparing those. And remember, dialectics is the process of trying to synthesize antitheses. So I think Tom is very much stating that comics can help us synthesize the scientific worldview and the mythological worldview, and kind of overcome the problems of the mythological worldview overriding our ability to think rationally. He seems to have some faith in that. I'm not sure I have the same faith. That's where I'd really like to dig in with him and clarify those kinds of things. But it's an interesting thought. In this section, he's talking about something I complain about all the time. I probably complained about it on this channel as well, is Simon Reynolds laments a shift in pop music from restless innovation pushing forward with violent severance from predecessors, jettisoning its superseded stages like rock 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, to the addiction with the past of constant revivals of the music of great decades. In fact, the last decade and a half may be better remembered for its technology than the music itself. And I think that's totally true. I feel like as a 90s kid, music was my whole identity. And my complaint about kids these days is that when I listen to their music or ask them what they're listening to, they're either listening to stuff that my parents listened to, or they're listening to something that sounds too much like music. Like, I definitely grew up in the era where like a guy hawking a loogie and chewing a hamburger to a microphone was like what was going on. And that idea of like, that's not music, that's just noise. Now I feel like us old fogies are like, that's too musical. It sounds too much like music. You kids are a bunch of pussies. And that's very well stated in here. And then he gives a really good piece of advice of dealing with nostalgia. And again, this is like Tom putting words to something I've just kind of always instinctively tried to resist, is I've always tried to resist nostalgia. I don't think it's healthy. I'd like to keep moving forward. And he suggests when you're feeling nostalgic and you're going to buy something because you're nostalgic, or you're going to go revel in a movie or something that you're nostalgic about, assume the nostalgic critical position. Now isolate the memory associated with the object. What is it you actually remember? Find out, like, it wasn't the toy that you cared about. It was the fact that you were like had a really nice childhood and the world was less complicated and your parents took care of everything, maybe. And use your nostalgia to be creative, which I think is a really good statement. But within that, this is something else I'd like to kind of have a debate with Tom on, or ask a little deeper questions, because I think he is suggesting it in some extent. I do think there is value, especially because I have been doing it mainly for the channel, is going back and rereading some things that you have fond memories of. Go back and listen to that album that you haven't listened to in a long time. I think if you approach it the right way, where you're not getting the pleasurable, like, serotonin bump from it or whatever, dopamine bump of nostalgia, it can be really helpful to re-explore something that had a big impact on you. Like, I'm currently rereading C.S. Lewis's Perelandra series, and that book, and obviously his essay Abolition of Man, had a huge impact on me when I was like 19, 20 years old. It kicked off my interest in philosophy, really, as far as I remember that, and Alan Moore's Promethea, coming from two totally different spiritual standpoints there. But those ignited my interest in philosophy. And I'm going back and rereading those Space Trilogy books from C.S. Lewis, and that is very much a healthy way that I am like, oh, man, I forgot that that's where I got that from. That's why I've been thinking about it. And it's a type of self-exploration that can be, I think, I don't even know if therapeutic's the right word, but it's just like really coming to know thyself. And in some sense, going back to the things that you're nostalgic for can be useful in that way. And I think you don't necessarily need to be doing the creating that he's suggesting, but you got to use that nostalgia. And I do think that's exactly right. Then issue 4 is the coming of the terraformer. So now we're looking at, our nature, the force of nature that he was talking about as terraformers that change our environment is kind of the topic of issue 4 here. Tom puts out some wacky hypotheses about the history of the world. This one here, speculate ancient aliens. This is my favorite one to shit on in front of my students. This is the idea that either transpermia, we got put here by aliens, or at least that aliens have come in and taught us technological things, and technological development is due to aliens coming and telling us something. That may be the case, but it's a really fucking stupid explanation for the idea of how we develop technology. Because if your question is, how did we get it? Well, let's just make it life. Go to the transpermia argument, same thing. How did life come to be? It's not really interesting to ask, how did life come to be on Earth? Like, it may be the case that aliens put us here, or that bacteria from another planet crash landed on a comet and infested our oceans and became life. Like, that could happen, but it doesn't, like, that's not as interesting of a question. It's interesting, how did life get on Earth in the first place? But the bigger question is, how did life come to be? And saying aliens put it here doesn't answer the question. It's just, in philosophy, that's called an infinite regress. It's just like, okay, well, the aliens put it here. Who made the aliens? The same way, God's a fucking stupid idea. Like, oh, well, things can't be unless they have a creator. Okay, well, we have to posit a creator. Well, then who created the creator if you're assuming things can't be without a creator? And then it's just an infinite regress. So anytime I run into arguments like that, we could be living in a computer simulation. I don't know. I don't care. It doesn't answer the actually interesting question. I don't know if Tom's a fan of that theory or not, but I think that one's funny. The rest of them are more interesting. Like, maybe we evolved out of aquatic apes. I don't know. Some really fun references here, obviously, to Jack Kirby's character. Some fun formal play here where we're now using the structure of the page to make like a fourth dimensional break. Is this weird? When I look around this gap, I have two heads. Always like that kind of stuff. I always love dimensional play in comics. Then I'm really, really glad that I got this and read this like a few days after I read all of Kevin Huizinga's work, because Tom is explaining the idea of the horizon, and I'm familiar with that from like Derrida and those kind of writers. I don't know, maybe Heidegger. I've only read like half of Being in Time, so I don't know where this idea of the horizon came from, and I'm not so sure what being delimited by a horizon means in philosophy. That's something I'm still a little vague on. But he's talking about that idea, philosophical idea of the horizon. And then he says, welcome to Huizinga Zone. We're in Huizinga space in an imaginary magnitude materialized by the line. And this way of rendering the horizon line here is something that Glenn Gange shows. I think that's what it is. In one of Kevin Huizinga's things, I think Glenn Gange's wife shows him how to draw this background so he can help her draw her comics, or vice versa. And so Tom is using this. And I know Kevin Huizinga at least used to be in Minnesota and teaching at the place Tom's teaching at, that Sean's also teaching at now. So I know they're friends. I know they're both very philosophical, and they must be talking a lot. So he's referring to some of Kevin Huizinga's ideas throughout. I noticed that here, and then he makes it more explicit later in the book. But I thought that was cool, using some other artists' stylistic reference to explain a concept. I just never got that idea out of Huizinga's work, but Tom makes it very clear to me. Something else formally that's really funny here, I got really frustrated because it looked like the book was misbound. Now we will enter the line, but we and will are cut off, and it's hard to see. But then the character at some point says, on the next page says, what did I say? So he's looking back, and it's like the words got cut off in the border. And that's really interesting, too. You can also call it the margin, and so the words have been marginalized, which is interesting. And that's the kind of language games that Derrida would play, too. You know, you marginalize. Like, I made a big piece of writing that made a joke about that in the Hermitage Auctions parody Heritage Auctions catalog that Dave and I made for selling the You Don't Know Jack artwork on that project we did. And I wrote a kind of deconstructionist piece about marginalizing people by having their face cut in half by the margin. Anyways, I think that kind of writing's bullshit. It's too easy. But it's a funny trick, and when Tom does it in comics and does it formally like that, it has a lot more impact for me. And then just this really cool, again, kind of Kevin Huizinga-ish way of representing the collapse of dimensions and like a holographic idea. Then we come to this, which was inserted. It's a little plate. It looks like it's hand signed by Tom, and he's got this representation here of the world mind body schema. This is where his essay comes in for the issue, and he very explicitly references Kevin Huizinga here with an image that I think is from Glenn Ganges, and you can see that way of drawing perspective and the flatland here in this image. I'm not sure, it doesn't say where this image came from, but I'm pretty sure that's familiar to me from reading all of the Kevin Huizinga stuff I got. And then this diagram here in this print. It's funny because when I read this page, I said they got that diagram wrong. Tom's missing something. And so I drew down the mental diagram I have of like the structure of existence, which is what he's drawing here. And then on the next page, they do a call for entries where Cartoon Dialectics poses a cartoon intellectual quest. What does the mind-body world schema look like in a post-typographical world? What shapes the cartoon man? And that goes back to the essays in issue 1, where Tom is talking about we're entering into this post-linearity, returning to the primitive, the digital primitive, and he thinks that cartoons are the best way to talk about that. And so he's like, your entry must answer the questions with a single image of the mind-body world schema. So something like this or this, and then he's saying, here's how to enter it. So maybe, Tom, I'm going to enter your thing, because before I turn the page, I drew my schema. I think you're asking the wrong question, though, and this is why I would like to talk to Tom more, is when you say the mind-body world schema, you're missing something. You're having like this triad here of like inside, outside, and the mind space, God space. I've tried to imagine this for myself as well, and I think what we're really looking at is a series of two-way interactions between, you're missing a fourth thing, which is what now I call the Ruliad. I just used to call it like the informational substructure, the data substructure of reality. And Kevin Huizinga actually talked about this, kind of in the Glenn Ganges book, where he talks about the filters on reality. So, Tom, and people watching, sorry, this is a long video, dense video, but hey, this work calls for it because it's really interesting. They've got this right in that there's the self, the world, and God. But I think these diagrams here, the Huizinga one, the one by Tom, and this one here, by Robert Flood, they're missing something. They're missing the idea that the world out here is also somewhat of a construct based on a separate world out here underneath it all, and this probably has a reciprocal relationship as well. But in my view, and now I use the term Ruliad because of Stephen Wolfram's idea of the Ruliad has given me a word for what I've kind of intuited, is that what reality is at base is every possible computation being run basically on a self-creating quantum computer of some sort. I don't know if that's Seth Lloyd talking about quantum computers. I don't know if Wolfram is willing to commit to the quantum computer idea, but he thinks the world is inherently at the lowest level of description, the lowest level of abstraction, which I get that term from Luciano Floridi's Philosophy of Information, that at the lowest level, or the broadest general way of describing things that encompasses the, like, everything else can fit in that category. You're talking about data, just data, ones and zeros. You're going down to, like, look, there's nothing, and then logically that implies something, and once you get nothing and something, you have a binary, and then you have the probability of there being nothing or something, which would be quantum logic. I don't know if there's such a thing as quantum logic or quantum logic gates, but that's reality. That's existence, the Ruliad. And we get access to that through our senses. There are filters and lenses that turn that data into content that we can interact with, and then we develop a self. Then there are multiple other selves circling this Ruliad here, seeing it through their lenses. We have the ability to communicate with other selves. There should be another little self in here, or a circle of selves looking at the world. I have to work on my diagram. Also looking at this, it's hard to draw in 2 dimensions. Kevin Huizinga could probably do it. I can't, or I'd have to think about it. But then the world, that's why I think this is we're missing existence out of this. The world is the kind of collective thing that all of the selves are agreeing upon to interact with each other within. We're basically data collections. Like a file has integrity in of itself. When I send you a file, I can say that file, like a digital object, can have borders and boundaries and have like identity as a unique thing. And so the way that our boundaries are constructed filter this information. Most of ourselves as humans share a similar type of construction, so we can perceive largely the same interpretation of the computational stuff, and then we come to a collective agreement about the world. And then in both collectively and individually, we do idealize the ideas that we get from our perceptions. We start to say, hey, like there's a tree. I've encountered this kind of organization before, and I can attach the idea of tree to it. So then you get the debate between Aristotle and Plato of whether those things are actually out here or whether those are just the way we're interpreting that data. Plato thinking that there are these forms, external, actual metaphysical things. Aristotle arguing the opposite, which is kind of more my view, and that there's a reciprocal relationship always that is constantly kind of constructing the world we exist in. Tom should know from Heidegger that this world is also always, what is your world at the moment has a lot to do with your mood you're in and your awareness, and these are kind of ever-shifting things. But anyways, Tom, that's my really quick piss poor attempt to draw my map of reality. How in the world that relates to post-typographical world or the shape of the cartoon man, I don't know. I think that's the way it always is, always was, and always will be. I don't think that schema will ever change. I think that we change it as our understanding gets better, but I don't think that has anything to do with the post-typographical world, and I have no idea how it relates to comics, but I will continue thinking about that, and hopefully we get to talk about it. Tom then goes on with this idea of terraforming. He tells the story of Utnapishtim and Anki from, I'm going to pronounce that wrong, but the Sumerian flood story. But he's basically looking at flood stories and the idea of the ark, and saying that contains a deep truth, and then talks about the idea of spaceship Earth, which I first encountered from Buckminster Fuller. I haven't seen anything where Tom explicitly refers to Buckminster Fuller, but I feel a lot of Buckminster Fuller's ideas underneath the surface of Tom's work as well. So this idea that our ark is the Earth, and instead of trying to create arcs to get off of it, we should be treating it as our own world ship. That's pretty interesting to me. And then that comes into the last part here, where I'm going to go into another one of my theories. But Tom is describing, for millennia we have debated what makes humans human. Is our big brains, or our ability to think rationally, or our use of tools, or are we a terraforming species? Clear the area. All of our abilities are directed at remaking the world. And I think Tom is totally right about that. But again, I'm not so prone to looking at that as what makes us uniquely us. I'm taking that larger view that I was praising Tom for in earlier issues, and I'm not sure, I don't know if he's just not going all the way with his ideas, because who knows what's coming with the next issue. But the way I've come to think about it is again, influenced by Luciano Floridi. So Floridi talks about these membranes, and each one of these membranes is like an interpretive filter on that computational data set that is the like ground floor of the hologram that is reality, just the data, the binary, the quantum probability logic of reality as it exists. And that as we barricade ourselves off from that, we create more and more filters, and those filters abstract things further and further. So if Floridi says there's a prebiotic, which in my understanding is just the data itself. Then there's the biotic environment, which is now there's a membrane which some of that data has constructed itself in such a way that it can be seen through the lens of space and materiality, so like matter. And that's Seth Lloyd's idea of it from qubit, that energy and quantum information are the same thing. So really there's probably not a prebiotic and a postbiotic so much as just a prebiotic way of looking things, or a non-biotic and then a biotic. But then very clearly there becomes a conscious membrane where the biotic, which is the environment, turns into things that can operate within the environment. They are conscious, they're aware of their surroundings in whatever limited sense and are interacting with it. And I think about that as there's now a body that's in an environment that's constrained by the environment and necessarily has to have a kind of adversarial relationship with the environment to continue its own life and produce more life. So body constrained by environment. Then when you get the cognitive, what Luciano Floridi calls the cognitive membrane, you get self-consciousness, not just consciousness, but self-consciousness. And of course, there's gray areas. We don't know when we switch from, like one of my dogs, I'm pretty sure is fairly self-aware, and the other one I'm pretty sure is fairly unaware of anything other than the present moment. So yeah, we don't know, but at some point you fully solidify a cognitive membrane, and then you're an individual, a self, and that's kind of where AGI is headed, is how do we make an artificial version of that. But in that sense, body has developed a mind which allows it to then not just respond to the environment, but actually terraform the environment, to manipulate the environment so that it is like very basic creatures just have to navigate the environment to survive. The more cognitive you get, the more you manipulate your environment to make it easier to survive in for yourself. And Tom talks about that, as we saw in earlier ones, that humans have this tendency towards dominating nature. This is what we talked about in Abolition of Man too, dominating nature so as to make it easier and more expedient for ourselves. And my idea, and I think Tom's idea and C.S. Lewis's idea, is eventually that's going to bite us in the ass and take us off the planet altogether. But I think that's where we've been. I think where we're at now is, and I see this a lot in just current thought about identity politics and all this stuff, even like just so much as like getting piercings or having breast implants or anything like that. Body is now being seen by the mind as environment rather than as an extension of itself. I don't think that's particularly healthy. I don't think there is a mind-body divide, and I don't think it's healthy to look at it that way. But I do feel like we're in a point where body is now seen as part of the natural environment, and so it's something that we're going to attempt to become masters of and manipulate and control and make what we want. And that's kind of what C.S. Lewis is talking about being a very dangerous erasure of humanity altogether, is that when you master nature to the point where you've mastered human nature, nature wins again in the end. And I extend that by saying I think the next step is where AI is trying to push, is try to some extent disembody a mind. Obviously, the AI will have to exist in some physical structure, but it seems like a disembodied mind largely. We could put it in robots, but it could also exist on this distributed network of the internet. That's very tempting because bodies suck, bodies hurt. Like the idea of like uploading into this box where we could have our way at all times and mind becomes the environment seems like this utopian ideal that we're currently pushing forward. So within Tom's larger project of utopias and dystopias, I don't know if that's what he's suggesting, but that's what I'm extrapolating out of it, is that what we're doing as terraformers is now not only wrecking the environment, but we're going to start breaking ourselves down to try and release the mind from the body. And in that state, mind becomes the environment, and you're looking for an infusion of mind into environment so that they can't be at odds with each other because they're the same thing. I think that's the desire. I think that's where we're headed. I think there's probably two ways to do that. One is the artificial route, or the virtual route, the simulation route, which is where most like uploading into the computer kind of ideas are at, is that we're just gonna like, as much as we can, create a artificial environment, and we're gonna try and put that's exactly to our liking, and we're gonna put ourselves in there. So we're gonna build a giant computer that can house all our consciousness, and we're going to each go in there and be able to construct our simulated reality how we want. That seems hellish to me. It's the temptation of heaven, but it's, I think, guaranteed hell. The other way that I don't hear people talking about so much is to try and saturate the natural environment with mind. And I don't even know what that would look like, but I think that's more of the like Zen, hippie, new wave, like become one with the world. And I think that's where Tom is at too, and I think that's what he's pushing for. So I don't see us necessarily as a terraforming species. I think that is, yeah, kind of what we're doing. But what I see is that we're at this point of membranes being developed just through the natural computational processes of running every possible computation, that we are the type of computational object that exists behind these barriers. And I think we're growing these new barriers, and it's removed us from our environment. And so we're trying to then fight against the environment, which now includes our own body, to create the environment to our will, rather than going back the other way, which is probably the healthy thing, and thinking, okay, how do we preserve the idea of consciousness, but then reintegrate it into the environment, not remove the membranes, because then you just destroy self, and that could happen in either way, but remove those membranes and saturate the environment with mind. So that's where I'm at as a thinker. I think that's as far as I've gotten in my life so far, and that pretty much brings us up through the end of issue 4, the newest issue of Cartoon Dialectics. And you can see that this was a very engaging series of comics, and you can see why I've been like chomping at the bit to talk about this, and having to wait a whole year. I couldn't hold it anymore after I read issue 4, but I feel like issue 4 kind of leaves off where I'm at. And so Tom, being a really smart guy who's putting things in a lot of the same things I think about in different ways, I'm kind of hoping issue 5 is like the answer to how we saturate the environment, maybe, or something like that. Like maybe Tom's seen further in this. So Tom, like, yeah, thank you. You've given me a majillion things to think about, and I do hope that we can expand upon all this at some point. It will probably be the most tedious, the longest video for everyone that we've ever done, but I don't care. I get to be selfish. All right, thanks everybody. Whole new world. 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 Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.